So I have these tiles that can be identified by their outline, their contents, or both. It can also be identified by the backs of them, which I don't usually post online. But I think the interesting thing about this is specifically these squares. I'm talking about this one and this one. And I think these are interesting because they generally have trends that are along the same lines, and that they have horizontal, vertical, and slanted components. And these can be uniquely identified by those components, at least in the context of this spread. And so that is something. But the significance of this is that you can tell a story specifically with these squares and their names. So here I have something that looks kind of like a sun. And I'm identifying that with this tile, this rectangular tile, and associating that with a square that represents the color of what I would want that sun to be. The other elements, like the canopy, the trunk, road, or grass, are also identified. In some cases, the identifier is more abstract in that it doesn't necessarily match one-to-one what's on the tile that it's representing. But because you have the context of knowing that this shape is probably going to be somewhere in this drawing, you can make the association. An AI tool, like an arbitrary AI tool, wouldn't necessarily be able to make this association automatically because there isn't anything that's concretely one-to-one associating these. Like you can kind of guess that this squiggle matches the title underneath, but it's not literally represented, and this isn't in any common language. But something that I think is kind of interesting about these is that you can use these squares as components for larger pictures or more detailed pictures. So here's just an animation of me going through the process of selecting specifically the elements that I want to arrange according to the drawing that I made on that blue sheet of paper. And I eventually used Stable Diffusion to turn it into something that's a bit more aesthetic. Something significant about this is that I've described my process. And I feel like that's going to be significant with art moving forward. But beyond that, here I have the original drawing that I made. And I've identified two elements, both the sun and the road. These are pretty abstract shapes. There's another drawing that I made where I've identified similar shapes. In this case, there's something that looks kind of like a wand to me, something that looks kind of like a person. That's this squiggle that used to be a road. And something that looks kind of like a lamp to me. And I've identified the lamp and the squiggle, the person. So you can see in the image blue 1 and blue 2 that there are similar shapes between these two, and they somewhat correspond to this scene, where the sun is in the top right corner and the road is in the bottom left corner. I have a lot of other squares and tiles that I've identified. Here I've outlined some of the shapes, and you can see that there are the titles of these two squares that I pointed out earlier, here and here. And I've identified the significant elements where there's a horizontal line and a slanted line, And with this one, there's a horizontal line and a vertical line. The ellipses that I've identified in pink kind of just say, and there's other stuff in this image that should match these ellipses. The main thing is that we don't really care about the ellipses if we're trying to uniquely identify the squares that they belong to. I've also identified shapes that resemble that sun image from earlier. Here we have a title that looks like that lamp or sun. And here we have two squares that kind of extend the concept. In this image, I've only flipped over. Let me turn down the stabilization so it's easier for me to circle. In this image, I've only turned over these two squares, which were in the original spread on the bench. I've outlined the elements that go into the drawing. You can see that one of the squares has 6 dots, or 2 sets of ellipses, and one of them only has 1. Because of the ways that I've identified them, you can kind of make the assumption that this square matches the corresponding tile. The square with 1 set of ellipses matches the tile with 1 set of ellipses. But you can also see that this square has vertical lines, horizontal lines, and vertical lines. And this tile does as well. The other square has a slanted line and a horizontal line. Set of lines, I should say. So this is just saying that it's possible to associate these rectangular tiles with these square tiles. So if I were to look at this image, which I've called question, one of the questions that I can ask is what happens in this part of the image for a square that has these trends, where there are these 3 slanted lines, these 9 horizontal lines. Somewhere in the image there are 3 horizontal lines at the top, 3 vertical lines on the side, 5 vertical lines on the bottom, 5 slanted lines in the middle, and then 3 slanted lines adjacent to that. If we were to go back to these tiles have similar elements. Just briefly pointing them out. These 5 lines right here satisfy the question that we're asking. In that, looking at the main element of that previous picture, where there are 3 slanted lines here, and then 9 horizontal lines here, then 5 slanted lines and 3 adjacent slanted lines. If we were to look at that previous question, we can associate this region of the image uniquely with that. over here, we might associate, okay, let's point this out. Here are 9, 3, and then 5. So maybe the question that we're asking is about this portion, but it doesn't really fit so well because we're assuming that this portion of the screen, this portion of the square, wouldn't be overlapping the lines that we previously identified. So in terms of asking that question, the one here, there's only one square in that previous image that would really match this question. And theoretically, if we were to give somebody a set of these squares, we can say, I will know that you got these squares when you can identify which one matches this question that I'm asking. Now, in terms of where I think creativity is going, I feel like just generally finding a way to embed meaning in the art that we create is just generally how we enjoy art. Like being able to look at something and appreciate its aesthetics is one thing, but aesthetics have a sense of novelty to them, where once we've acknowledged the aesthetics and we know that it's there, and we know that we can return to that set of aesthetics, the novelty kind of fades away. And the thing that we're left with is the pursuit of meaning and understanding why we're engaging with art. So one of the stories that I'm telling is about Boof, my dog, and the Blueberry Fool. And I have this mentioned here. Here it says Boof and the Blueberry Adventures as a title in this rectangle. And you can see a picture or a drawing of my dog, drawing of a blueberry, some sort of land, some sort of place where both of those exist. And here's another tile that says the Blueberry Fool. I have that kind of drawn out here as well. When I mention blueberries, I've identified those in this drawing. And just to keep it simple, I've made blueberries represented by a circle with another circle inside of them. In this case, there are 5 circles. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, plus 3 that are concentric. One of the questions that I could ask about this is how many blueberries are there? And in this case, there would only be 3. And then there are these 2 circles, which I wouldn't necessarily count. So if I were creating a website or creating a movie where I'm trying to tell a story of the Blueberry Fool, that would be in reference to a story that I'm telling across scenes, where I mentioned the Blueberry Fool here, and there's a blueberry here. I'm not sure if you would consider what's in these tiles to be blueberries, but if you said that in this image there were 4, that would be understandable. I accidentally marked that. I didn't mean to. Forgot to undo it. Moving forward, just generally, I'm seeking to make my art cohesive across frames. So part of the story that I'm telling is how to bring my style into other dimensions. And I have this concept where this is a 5-dimensional dragon that's caught in 2 dimensions. If I were to animate this, then it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, but there are different elements that I could use to tell a story. Here are 5 squares. So those could represent the 5 dimensions. And within those squares, I have these images. These could represent characters. The bottom panel, I have symbols that are part of a language that I've developed called Swoop. Generally, I call that Unified Augmentation Language, and I use these symbols as the Swoop dialect because I want to make sure that other people can extend this as well. So as I introduce these elements, I want to make sure that my work is namespaced. I feel like that's it.